and it's the whole topic of strategic sources of value. And welcome to this webinar, talking about strategic sources of value, part of our Navigating the Blizzard webinar series as we're going through this crisis, as we're going through this challenging time. We trust that you are staying safe, staying secure, staying healthy. And in South Africa, we are currently obviously about to enter the second phase of our lockdown, a slight lifting of restrictions. And part of the timing of this webinar, I believe, is that I think we're moving towards an inflection point. I think we're moving towards a time where it'll be slightly different going forward than it has been up until now. As the world starts to open up. So we've effectively had between 4 and 6 weeks of chaos, of crisis, and it's now an opportunity, I think, to start looking ahead, start thinking about the way forward to some extent. And I trust that we'll be able to explore some aspects of that together today. Today's webinar, as usual, is a working webinar. The webinar today comes with one warning at the bottom there. This webinar has lots of questions. So what I suggest you do with this webinar is re-look at it afterwards. Obviously, go through it now, take notes, engage with me via questions and answers in the chat box as we go. And then also think about it in terms of, what do you need to review looking forward? And especially with regard to some of the key elements, there's going to be quite a lot of content. I'm going to be throwing quite a lot of questions at you as we go, with the aim of, as we've always said, helping you take the next steps in your business. Think through what the implications of those steps are. Make the right decisions, because now is a critical time to be engaging in decision making, engaging with your team, thinking about the decisions you need to take to position yourself to actually see this whole thing through. Now, I also think what is emerging as well is a clear understanding that the length of time we need to look at is probably longer than hoped for. Longer than anticipated, and our businesses are going to be facing a series of challenges as we go forward. Critical to leadership at this time is summed up in this quote, that the very essence of leadership is that you have a vision. And what I love about the word vision, what I love about the concept of vision, is it speaks to the capacity of sight. And so a lot of what we're going to look at today, what I'm going to try to provide you with is a set of elements, things to look out for. What can you see in the environment around you? So when we talk about sources of value, it's really looking, it's paying attention clearly to your industry, clearly to the industry in your sector, clearly to what's happening in the economy and the environment and the society around us. And so you have to be able to blow a certain trumpet. You cannot blow, leaders cannot blow an uncertain trumpet during this time. Roadmap for today, we're going to be looking briefly, and in a couple of the previous webinars, we've covered a bit more in detail strategic thinking or thinking strategically, decision making we've covered. So I want to review a couple of those concepts or ideas, and then we'll look at a number of sources of strategic value. And as I said, fair amount of material content. Go back and relook at the questions as we go. It's important to understand that strategic thinking, there is a cycle of strategic thinking, and part of strategic thinking is to really be looking to renew what we do, to change it, to fix it, to make it better, make it different. That's the renewal. We do that by looking at where we are now, looking at where we've been, and looking around us. But between the review and the renew is a critical element that hopefully will spark some thinking around today, and I call it reimagine. One of the key faculties of leaders that is being put under huge stress, huge pressure at the moment, is this concept of we need to start imagining a different future, because the future is not going to be what the past was. There will be certain elements that go forward, but on the whole, there are going to be some significant changes to not just the way we live, but the way we do business, the way we can do business, the perception of value. And so it's with that in mind that I want to think about and trigger your thinking this afternoon. If we think about strategic thinking and thinking strategically, one of the key elements of strategic thinking is a clear understanding of where we are right now and what is really going on. That's what I mean by diligent diagnosis. And part of the diagnosis today is going to be saying, what is really going on in the environment? What are the sources of advantage? And obviously, there's a flip side to many of these things. Sometimes the source of advantage will be a source of risk. Being clear also about where you are positioned and what your perspective is at the moment. So what can you see? What's the position of your business? Re-looking at what you have available to you, what capabilities you have, what skills you have in the business, because your positioning and a clear understanding of your positioning in the environment is also a source of advantage, and we'll look at that as well. And then thinking about clear, compelling, coherent action. So a well thought through doing needs to flow from strategic thinking. If we don't have coherent and compelling action that moves you in a certain direction, because it's only when you move that you can test and actually see whether that direction is a good one. Remember, we're entering a period of numerous decisions. And so your first decision may not be the best one, but if it moves you, you can test the decision very, very quickly. And then coherence. Often we'll look at everything around us and we'll be overwhelmed. And when we're overwhelmed, the danger is that we start to lose coherence. Our teams start to lose coherence. And coherence is going to be important because it's like our businesses, we have to view almost like an arrowhead. And moving forward, it's the coherence in our businesses that will drive the direction and will drive towards a clear destination as well. We've also spoken a bit about scenario thinking, and it's really critical as we unpack some of the thoughts around sources of advantage, that we are talking about the future history of your business. And that's the way that I love to define, or has been used to define scenario thinking. So if we're in the future, looking back, what would we see as well? And so it's really exploring the full range of choices and decisions that we have to make, because in the current environment, it often looks like there's very little we can do. But if we explore together what various options there are, and we try to explore and unpack different options, we will realize that there's normally more options available to us than we initially think. And then we need to test these. And again, as we go through the questions I'm going to throw at you, use them to test in your own businesses. Take each one, take it over, unpack it, explore it. And essentially it's preparing a rough timetable. And that's scenario thinking is also based on a critical definition that I often pack of governance. And the word governance is a very powerful one, because in the word governance is a picture of strategy. The word governance comes from the Greek word that means to steer or pilot a ship. And so the clear thing about the pilot of a ship is the pilot of the ship is the one who is the custodian of the destination. A pilot is judged by not how well the ship runs today, but whether the ship achieves or reaches its destination. And obviously there is this balance between the now and the not yet. And so in scenario thinking, we have to think from the future, which means we have to understand why we exist, because the purpose of the organization is what ties the present to the future. That undergirds everything, and we've unpacked some of those concepts. We have to think about what the picture or pictures of the future histories of the company could look like. Expanding out what the options are and describing them so we can recognize, when we look at where we are at the moment, what are the tensions, what are the dimensions, what are the sources of value that lie between us and where we are in the future. And sources of value essentially lie in this middle space. They lie in the space here is where the sources of value lie. Another way to think about scenario thinking in this time is, maybe it's not about building a set of scenarios in alongside one another at a certain point in the future, but it could be about building a set of scenarios that unfold towards the future. And I think that's probably what we need to be thinking about in crisis. So in crisis, what tends to happen And it's a natural thing. And you'll see some of the sources of advantage are aimed at identifying something that is not necessarily in the long term or medium term, but actually in the short term. And so a lot of us in the last 6-12 months have sat down and looked at our longer term vision, simply because we've moved into a new decade. There's been an opportunity to think about strategy. And so we've looked at a 2030 or a 2028 or a 2025, strategy for our businesses. And so we don't want to abandon that. That can remain our long-term picture, scenario of the future, but we do need to think in the shorter term. So what is it looking forward? We've looked into the longer term, but what does that look like in the shorter term and the shorter term, the 6 to 9 months that lie ahead, possibly end of the year? What are we thinking of being? Where do we need to be by the end of 2020? Where do we need to be by 2022 or 2023, so that we can unpack, and as we go forward, we can continually test what we're doing as we move into the future. And so with that in mind, with those two key elements in mind of diagnosis, perspective and position, coherent and compelling action as the essence of strategy, and really thinking about that, and with the longer term, the scenario thinking in mind, how do we start to seek strategic sources of value? Where should we start and what should we do? And this is the question that I'd like you to be unpacking for yourself as we go through this webinar. And as always, please engage on the Q&A box, and please engage on the chat box. And especially as we draw to the close, if you have questions as we go through the webinar, I'd love to explore and get your opinion on some of the elements. And as I said, what we're looking at doing primarily is asking the question, what do we look for? So what should we be scanning the environment for? So what the captain of the ship has to do all the time, and obviously he has crew that give him that feedback and also assist him or her to do it, is they need to be continually fixed in terms of the destination, understanding this is the destination we want to get to. And so having the picture of that in the mind, even if they can't see it with their eyes, but the environment is always being scanned to say what actually is out there. What are the elements that we need to think about, talk about, explore in our business? And so with that in mind, let's jump in. And there's a whole lot of them, and each one of them has a heading and a bit of an unpacking what we're thinking about. Some of them I'll try to provide some examples, some current examples, what I see happening, and some possibly some historical examples of how these things have unfolded in the past. And so the first one is really understanding our businesses and understanding what are the differences in our businesses. You see advantage, we're looking for advantage. Most of our businesses wouldn't have got to the point they're at if there hadn't been some clear differences in the way we go about doing business. If all we've tried to do is replicate, cut and paste what someone else has done, there is no advantage in what we do. And so advantage is rooted in differences. It's in the asymmetries between rivals. And so it's finding out, what are you doing that other people aren't doing? How are you doing it? Sometimes that's in your product, sometimes that's in your service, sometimes that's in your relationship. But it's really the leader's job, it's the captain of the ship's job to understand, how is this ship different? What can it do that other ships can't do? Which winds can it face? Which directions can it go? How quickly can it turn? The agility conversation, important to really understand, which means a knowledge of one's competitors, one's partners in the environment and in the sector, absolutely critical. An example of utilizing asymmetries or advantages is summed up in these two pictures. This first picture obviously is the 9/11 picture, where there was an incredible catastrophe because of the advantage certain people used to get training, get access to training, get access to aeroplanes, and then destroy two significant buildings and kill a whole lot of people. But the different type of advantage was used to seek the person at the core of that, and that is the compound that Osama bin Laden was eventually tracked down to. And yet, completely different sets of organizations. The terrorist organization that had advantages because of the nature of what it was. The US military that had advantages because of the nature of the information that it had. And in thinking about advantage, we think about two types of advantage and what we do with advantage in our organizations. And the first one is about deepening the advantages we have. Secondly, extending the advantages. And what I mean by these, as I said, lots of information, lots of ideas, lots of thoughts. So advantage, deepening the advantage is essentially asking the question, where is the surplus? So it's what's the gap? And in this, an example of widening the gap between the value and the cost. And that's one of the critical things that businesses have to continually do all the time. It doesn't happen because there's often an understanding or belief that improvement is a natural iterative process, whereas often improvement is not. Often improvement is a quantum process, and that's what we need to be thinking about in deepening our value. It also doesn't happen because there are often restrictions to the mechanisms. So isolating mechanisms surrounding important methods are weak. We hope to catch a free ride off the improvements of others. And so we need to protect or embed in the business the advantages so that we can have sufficient difference, sufficient asymmetries in our businesses to leap ahead of our competitors, or even to take advantage, because I'm not sure if today we're thinking so much about competition as we are thinking about survival. One of the examples, and it's a good question to ponder for a couple of seconds, is that the single thing that created the biggest change in transportation. So transportation used to be a really difficult thing because there were lots and lots and lots of asymmetries in what was being transported. Transportation was a challenge because how did you put all of these things? How did you package things? How did you create, how did you price? All of the different elements of transportation were critical and very difficult to handle until someone came up with an extremely simple idea by saying, let's put everything in a box, a very big box, a container. And that's all a container is, which meant that if it was the ships that systematized the container transportation, it was the ports and the docks that put in place the systems for offloading and unloading containers. It simplified the pricing element, it simplified the entire business model, and it created huge advantage because the countries that invested in containerization in their ports were the ones who actually leapt ahead and became the hubs of a lot of the distribution channels in the world today. Whereas those who didn't, or acted late, acted second, didn't take advantage of that specific asymmetry or difference in the marketplace. And so, are there things emerging now in the transports, the supply space, the retail distribution channel space, the restaurant space that can be rethought of in the same way that someone rethought of transportation? By saying, well, what happens if we put all the little things into a big box and that becomes the standard for transportation? And so that's deepening one's advantage, is really rethinking how we do things based on what our capabilities and our skills are. Extending advantage, so the two things, remember, deepening advantage and extending the advantage, are really looking at moving into new fields and new competitions. So one of the challenges in the crisis today is that a lot of the business models we have, a lot of the capabilities we have in our businesses, the skills and resources that have led us to be successful or to succeed in the past, are not necessarily usable right now in the current form that they're at. An example of that is the aeroplanes that were transporting people. And so a lot of airlines are in huge trouble, but there are a few that have stepped into the gap quite quickly to say other things do need to be transported, medical equipment. And so you had both Kenya Airways jumping on that bandwagon, in a sense, Virgin Air getting into that space of actually transporting what the world needs right now, because they didn't see their skills and resources and capabilities as limited to transporting people. They saw it as transport, and the infrastructure, the skills and resources that was used in one way could be used in another way. And so it's building on your strengths and capabilities, not on your products and services. You see, your products and services are the result of combining certain things in a certain way. And that's obviously created value But it's looking deeper than that and saying, where does your advantage, if you extend your advantage into different areas, deepen it in terms of thinking about your business in a different way, and really trying to answer this question going forward. So what is your difference that makes a difference? How is your business different from the competition, and how is that going to make a difference going forward? And so the key question to ask in this space, and you'll see as we go through, I've put a whole lot of slides on dark background, so you can simply go through the webinar afterwards and pause on these slides and then review and unpack. So are there ways you can deepen or extend your advantages given the changes in the environment today? So where are the differences? Where are the asymmetries in the environment? So that's advantage. Leverage, and we often hear about this, and obviously this is, a lever is a great thing, but a lever can be a very dangerous thing. But in strategy, understanding leverage is that what you're trying to do with a lever is you're trying to focus energy, you focus ideas, energy, and action. The focus channeled at the right moment onto the pivotal objective can produce a cascade of favorable outcomes. And the challenge with using leverage, though, is you need to find not just the lever, but also the pivot point, because what a pivot point does with the lever is it multiplies the effectiveness of the effort. And so what leverage consists of is strategically, it consists of a number of things. Firstly, there's the anticipation. And the anticipation is where one identifies the lever in the market. It's the habits, preferences, policies of others. So it's scanning the environment to ask the question, what are people doing and what is being done given also the constraints and the inertia in the environment? Because what leverage does is it tries to overcome the constraints by providing an effort into what's most pivotal. So what you need to think about is, well, what is most pivotal in your environment? What is going to magnify your effort? And that magnification of effort is how either natural or created imbalance is activated in a system. And then, so it's the anticipation is the trend, is what's happening. What are people preferring? What are people doing? How is buying behavior going to change? People aren't going to want to be comfortable getting into rooms with a whole lot of people. So there was a survey I saw in the last few days where they asked questions about people's, willing to go to a restaurant versus takeout, willing to go to a cinema versus obviously the access we have to movies online. And still there's a very great trepidation about going into a room with a whole lot of other people at the moment. And so some of those things are going to change. So we've got to think, how are habits being challenged? How are preferences going to change? What policies are being put in place, especially if they're policies that we are subject to, because the authorities that we need to comply with are doing things that we can anticipate. Looking at what's most pivotal, making a concentrated application of effort. So focus on the few things to focus your effort on. Often what happens in this time, we can list a whole lot of things. We can identify lots and lots of things, but the key thing about leverage is it focuses effort on a single point in order to create the highest opportunity or value at the end of the day. So what sources of leverage are available to you at the moment in the marketplace? There's that big rock that needs to be moved. The business is struggling. Where are the key elements that we can apply effort to, and where is the pivot? Where can you use leverage? Where and how? Where does it exist? And this is where I really encourage you to get together with your teams and have a leverage discussion as well as an advantage discussion as well. Proximate objectives, advantage, leverage, proximate objectives. What this is, it's an interesting one, because what happens in a crisis, as I mentioned, is that our timeline shortens. And so the danger is we may have been pursuing long-term great visions, we're going to change the world, but actually one of the most powerful things to identify right now is a short-term objective. That's what proximate means, something that's close. It's within our proximity. It's something we can do something about fairly quickly and easily. it's close enough at hand to be feasible. And remember, I mentioned that one of the challenges we need to do is we need to be able to act and test and act and test, so that that iteration between doing and testing is going to become critical as new business models emerge. And so proximate objective names a target that the organization can reasonably be expected to hit, even overwhelm. So are there things that you can just do incredibly well right now based on your skills and abilities? Now, an ironic example of that is actually putting a man on the moon. So in the 60s, early 60s, when America announced, and America stood up and said, we can actually put a man on the moon, people thought that's we call it a moonshot. But actually that was a well-formed opinion based on scientific and technical expertise, because they'd already been to space. Okay, and I'm not nullifying and diminishing the feat, but by putting it in place and by actually saying this is what we want to do, it created an objective, and what an objective did. And so the first speech around putting a man on the moon was made in the early 60s, and there was a man on the moon by the late 60s. And so within a 10-year period, it went from announcement to accomplishment. And what that did is it created a huge amount of momentum in the States. And obviously the whole space race was one, in a sense, and was one that was unfolding. And so to create that momentum in the economy. So what happened in science in America? It exploded because there was this objective that everybody was pursuing. And so in all of our businesses, what do we need to look at? What do we need to take a strong position on and create some clear options when one cannot look too far ahead? So it's saying, what can you see? What is that objective? Is that objective something that you can accomplish by the middle of the year instead of by the end of the year? Is that objective something that you can build a new product or a new set of value that you can put into the market in record time, because everybody's sitting at home and got some time on their hands, although many of us are really busy. But it's especially in times of uncertainty and in a crisis, what a proximate objective does is it basically facilitates the generation of momentum and movement. And momentum and movement enable us to then direct things towards a clear destination. You see, the movement may be in the wrong direction initially, but because there is movement, we can get things going and we can change direction when there's movement. We can't change direction when there's no movement. And that's one of the challenges. And so are there proximate objectives you can pursue based on, remember what I said, based on your skills, expertise, and positioning? So understand, where is your business currently positioned? What can you do? Not in terms of your current products and services, especially if those are being challenged, but what capabilities do you have that can be redeployed, changed in deployment? Are there skill sets that your people have that you haven't explored in a lot of depth before? What is the actual expertise on your team? Maybe there are things on people's CVs that you need to go back and reread people's CVs, because maybe there's a combination of skill sets that will enable you to identify and pursue a proximate objective. Linked to this, and I suppose it's also related to the current. So proximate says from here, what is close by. Chainlink systems looks at our business and says that all of our businesses consist of a set of links that ultimately deliver the value, the product, the service, the activities that are combined to provide value at the end of the day. And so it's understanding what the link systems in our business are and really looking at it. It's taking a step back from our business and saying, what do we have? What is strong and what is weak? Because the danger is that we can sometimes try to only focus, and I know that I've emphasized capabilities and skills, but we sometimes need to focus, and our advantage comes on fixing what's the weakest. Because the thing that is going to destroy us as a business is the weakest point. So a system has this chain link logic when its performance is limited by its weakest subunit or link. Now, when there is a weakest link, so this is a good opportunity in this time to re-examine your business model, re-examine what's worked, what hasn't worked, being very honest with what you've done well at and what you haven't done well at. You don't make the chain stronger by strengthening everything else. You make the chain stronger by strengthening the weakest link. And if there is a link in your business that is weaker than every other part of your business, then this is an opportunity in this time to strengthen it, to create sources of value. You see, the flip side of that is that there can be huge crises if we don't. An example of this is the space shuttle that exploded in one of the earlier flights. And one of the challenges was there were systems that were untested, there were conditions that weren't thought through, but this entire explosion, number of people were killed in this. It was a tragedy, but it boiled down to not a major catastrophe. It ended up in a major catastrophe, but it initiated with just an O-ring. So you can see in the arrows at the bottom part of that, the bottom example here this is where there was an O-ring, and because the temperature was slightly different and it hadn't been tested and the day was colder, and if you unpack it and explore and Google this account, it's really fascinating that a tiny thing could lead to such a massive disaster. And as our businesses start to move again, and move possibly in different directions, maybe have to move faster than ever before, because as things start to open up, some of our businesses are going to be in the position to really take advantage of some unfolding things. Let's take this opportunity to get value or advantage by examining the chain link systems that exist. Where are the inherent weaknesses in our businesses that we can fix? Because by fixing them, especially if it's a challenge in your entire industry, good question to ask is, what is the thing that your entire industry battles with all the time? If you can find the solution to that in this time, then you'll be way ahead of everybody else coming out of the blocks on the other side. So what chain link systems exist that you can take advantage of or find sources of value advantage in? Using design. So there's a lot of emphasis on design thinking, on approaching things with a design perspective. Now, often what we do is we think design only applies to physical things, but actually design applies to the entire way that our business runs. We design processes, we design activities. I often think that we mistake, we use the word performance, and we don't recognize that the word performance can be used slightly differently in a different context. So we use it in an organizational context where performance is linked to achieving objectives. But if we take a step back and we put performance into another context, the theater, we realize that a performance is structured and designed. It's not random. We don't leave an actor. An actor doesn't walk onto stage and make up the lines. The actor walks onto the stage and flows through a designed process from where they are on the stage, what they say, how they act, how they behave is a method of design. Movies are like that. We think that we're watching, real people in real situations, and yet I sometimes take a step back and say, well, this person is surrounded by cameras and has got probably green screens behind them. It's design that actually creates that sense of reality in a movie. And so another example of this is the military. So the way wars have been fought over years has been a method or a matter of design. And that comes from the word strategy, comes from the word generalship, the command or leading the army. It's a matter of design. Armies and battles are fought and won because of design. And Mintzberg said that strategy, therefore, is a high-level stream of decisions aimed at achieving one or more goals under conditions of uncertainty. And what that takes is what we need to think about then, when we think about strategy and design, we need to think about the fact that there is a level of premeditation. So I used the word or anticipation earlier. A big part of the way forward is to anticipate better, to premeditate, to think about what's going to happen, because we're not designing with the past in mind, we're designing with the future in mind, anticipating how other people are going to respond. And are there other people who we can partner with, or other people that we need to compete against? All right, where do we position ourselves in terms of where other people are positioned or other businesses are positioned? And then it's creating a purposeful design of coordinated actions as a result of thinking through our businesses from a design perspective as well. So premeditation is designing and planning in advance, debating what what do we determine ahead and where do we allow for on-the-spot adaptation? And I think there's going to be an important balance of those two things going forward. What do we set out as the route we want to follow, and where do we allow our people, where do we allow our teams, where do we allow the changes to be made as and when necessary, especially as things unfold in an uncertain environment. There's always some form of planning. See, winging it is not strategy. And I know some people use the phrase, well, we just have to wing it going forward and hope for the best. No. There may be some adaptation and agility, but winging it is not strategy. Anticipation of others is thinking about how are other people going to respond. And this is a good opportunity to engage as well, because as I said, anticipation of others' behavior will provide for us opportunity to partner with certain people and possibly to avoid certain people. We choose who we can work with in our businesses, and this may be an opportunity to remap the network of other parties that we're willing to work together with. And so how well do you anticipate others' behavior? How are you monitoring it in the environment? What can you do together better than you can do apart? And what can you do apart that you can do better than you can do together? And that's a challenge in design as well. And then a purposeful coordination or purposeful design of coordinated actions. So not always a choice, because the strategist is not always given a clear set of alternatives. So we often think that, and decision-making is inherent in strategy, but we've got to think about the construction of our outcomes as opposed to clear decisions that are made and implemented, because decision-making is often done on the fly. And that isn't winging it, it's allowing for agility in the space that's already been thought about and planned. So the path has been set out, but the specific ways forward can be things that we need to design on an ongoing basis. And so when you think about your organizations, how can you use design to your advantage? What elements of your business, looking at your business model, can be better designed? Not just your products and services, but your activities. Your physical layout of your offices will need to rethink design. A lot of questions and a lot of challenges in that space. And then it's using what I call dynamics. And this is it's looking for and finding and searching for the fresh, undefended high ground in our environments. And as the market has been purged of a lot of activity and really been decimated to a large degree, and even though we're talking strategy and trying to be looking forward, I recognize that there are a lot of businesses that are really battling. But that has meant that looking ahead, there is some fresh, undefended high ground. Some parties that we would have expected before to dominate certain areas of the market are not going to be there. They're going to choose to do something different. And so it's taking advantage of a wave of change, transition, and crisis. So it's obviously taking a position and looking, but saying, where are those changes and how can we take advantage of them? What dynamics in the marketplace that we can think about? And one of the key areas to take advantage or to use dynamics is to create your own fresh, undefended high ground. This is through pure innovation. Are there things that have never been done before? Maybe you've had a dream that you haven't been able to pull off or haven't been able to expand on or build or grow. Maybe one of those old notebooks, you've got some sketches of a business model that was never quite doable because of the way things were. Things are going to be different going forward. And so maybe this is an opportunity to really think innovatively, think out the box. Creating your own fresh, undefended high ground. What is going to be brand new in the environment? It's also looking, as we've done in a couple of webinars, and saying, what is the purpose in your business? Do you have a purpose that is deep enough that gives you a difference that actually matters? Question to ask aligned with that is, if your company disappeared today, would the world be different tomorrow? And maybe to think, well, if you are the one who can successfully meet needs, provide, for what people need going forward, provide opportunities for people, you're going to be a business that has a purpose that gives you a difference that matters and will be meaningful. So looking back from your anticipated 2030 vision to today, what are the things that actually you need to dig deep to? How do you redefine your purpose as well? And then some of it is, what external changes are happening in the environment at the moment. And my perception, and again, it's just my perception, is that we've been through, the world has been through severe lockdown and is starting to emerge. We've started to turn the corner. We're starting to see possibly some light. And one of the things that is emerging is that we've got to look further into the future than possibly we were a month ago. A month ago, we were saying maybe this thing is going to last 3 months or 4 months, maybe 6 months. I think we're realizing now that this crisis is going to be with us for a couple of years at the very least. And it's certainly going to change business models into the future, because the reinvention of business models is going to be something that will be lasting. And if you can be on the right side of that equation by identifying not just internally what you can redesign or think about or exploit in terms of dynamics, and exploit in inverted commas, but what external exogenous waves of change. So what's emerging? What new things are emerging? New ways of thinking, ways of being. What waves are washing through your organization or washing past your organization? And again, understanding that your ability to take advantage of those is based on your skills and abilities at a deep level in the organization, and not just, remember, you're competing on capabilities and not just on products or services. And so when we think about that, it's thinking, what is the leader's job? The leader's job is to really look for attentiveness, inventiveness, insight, to looking at the power of your purpose as an organization. You need to think about what waves or wind of change can you exploit by understanding how you believe it's going to emerge and morph and change. And that channeling resources, applying your resources to the areas of advantage that are emerging, the dynamics that are becoming valuable and defensible as they play out. So it's identifying what new initial conditions. And so in systems thinking, one of the key tools I believe that is going to be critical going forward is what's called systems thinking or complexity thinking. And complexity thinking or systems thinking starts by saying, how can we identify the emerging initial conditions? So how can we be attentive to the earliest sight of what we think is going to unfold? We may not know what it looks like in the future, but it's the first move in a direction that if we can pick up on that gentle breeze that will become a wind later on, we can then help and use it to help our businesses take shape. And sometimes those things are just beneath the surface. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of information just below the surface. And so seeking out the right information sources is absolutely critical, because what you read, what you process, how you examine information is going to be critical to help you identify these new emerging conditions. And it has to do with really trying to get the right level of insight and foresight. These emerging initial conditions, they may erupt into a powerful disruptive force. And I know we've used this phrase disruption. We've tried to be disruptive in our businesses, and sometimes that has led to more destruction than not. I'm trusting in a sense that the disruption in the environment that we've seen will enable us to take advantage of the emerging conditions and build resilient, powerful, strong, robust, adaptable businesses in this environment. And so we've seen the disruption come from outside and not from inside. And the way we respond is going to be critical in this time as well. And so those initial conditions help you, identify the service gap. So what gaps are you seeing ahead of you? What elements, what are people not able to do that you could do if you could reconfigure, redesign, relook at your business as well? And obviously it's identifying those and applying your resources, because those are the new leverage points. You want to find pivot points in the environment. It's asking the question, looking ahead over the next few months and into the next couple of years, where are the opportunities going to lie because of the way business is changing? And those opportunities that are going to be presented, some of the things that could be guideposts for this, because a crisis is a time to, I've put in brackets there, really, really, really watch out for the guideposts. So think about, what are the guideposts? What are we looking for? One of the things we're going to see happen is that pricing is going to change. And so in your business, you need to ask the question, how will the cost base of your industry change? What is going to go up? What is going to go down? What is going to go sideways? What is going to be unattainable, or the supply is going to dry up? What are people no longer going to buy? And how's that going to change the cost base, the structure, the cost structure, or the flow of money in your business? Because those will be triggers that can help you find, or they'll be guideposts that can help you find some of those dynamics. Could be regulation, deregulation, re-regulation. Without a doubt, we're in the throes of it at the moment, where there's a lot of regulation. We are very aware of the fact that we are under lots of adjustments that governments are making. Some good, some bad, some comfortable, some uncomfortable, most uncomfortable, okay? But it's also, what are those going to apply to businesses? Some people are going to be able to access funding easier than others. It's going to change the whole external. And so how are these things going to change in your environment, in your sector? What's going to be supported by regulation? What's going to be made more difficult by regulation? Again, anticipating that. What are the transition guideposts to look for from a regulation or deregulation or re-regulation point of view? And then what predictable biases are there at work? So some things, and I know that we are emphasizing that a lot has changed and a lot will change, but some things will keep being what they are being, or what they have been. Human nature to some extent is going to remain the same. Some of the sales momentum, and in some businesses, your sales momentum is not that threatened by what's happened in the marketplace. Other times it's changed. But despite the crisis, we do remain creatures and I think organizations of habit. So what's predictable? What's the predictable response in your industry? What do you expect to happen when things start to open up or start to change? And will that be good or bad for you? And which of those biases are biases that will be helpful to you in moving forward? And which of those biases will be unhelpful? Which of those biases, those predictable biases, are hardwired into your business that may be not that helpful? Whereas which are the strengths that can assist in looking at the way forward? So what predictable biases are at work? These are some of the dynamics in your industry going forward. What are the incumbents? So in every sector, and as Sadar, we work with a lot of up and coming, a lot of growing businesses, and so we're often not on the incumbent side, but a lot of the time when we're helping companies to look at the leadership and their boards, we're looking at learning from either what the incumbents in their sector are doing, the dominant parties, or trying to define themselves against what the dominant players are doing. So either learning from or we're reacting against. In every sector going forward, we're going to expect certain incumbent industries and firms to want things to go back to the way they were. That's the nature of bigger business. Big business will want to go back to the way things were. They're going to resist the transition, especially when it threatens to undermine the position that they have established over time. And so it's recognizing where some of the incumbents are going to be incapable of responding to some of the challenges, and some will have far more capital and resources to try to persuade or manage the changes in the way that they want. And so how do we respond? Sometimes it's a transition guidepost to say, what do we look out for? Because some of that we can go with, and that's good. Some of it we can go against, and that's good. So how do we position ourselves? So who is responding and how are we responding based on the incumbents in the industry? And then there's this concept called attractor state. So in every, for one of the key determinants in a business, and again, some of this is changing, but there's an attractor state is describing how an industry should work in light of the way technology works, demand works. So there are some dynamics, and remember, these are all dynamics that we're unpacking here. So based on that, it gives a sense of direction, a sense of evolution in the industry. Now, these are a bit like they pull us, or they tend to move in a certain direction or not. And so each of our industries will have some things that there is an attractor state because it's pulling us in a certain direction, whereas some of those attractor states are not going to be helpful in the future because of the crisis. And so it's asking the question for ourselves, what's the best place for our business to be in? Are there other parties in our sector that we can work together with to create an alternative attractor state in our business? Some of that is linked to, what's accelerating things in the industry we're in and what's inhibiting or impeding the movement in our industry. And obviously, we are being hit on all sides by different currents that flow through our industries. And some of those currents will remain and will continue as they have before to an extent, the strongest ones. So the strongest currents, it's likely that some of those will remain to an extent and be the most resilient. The weaker currents, the weaker accelerants and inhibitors in the market will probably change. And so it's helpful to identify what are those in the market. Is it a people issue? Is it a technology issue? Is it an economic issue that are determining which direction our sector is going in at the end of the day? And so last set of dynamics that are important to think about, and as we wind up, and I know that I've given you a lot of information and a lot to think about in your businesses, and I'm encouraging you to go back and to relook at it. But there are these two concepts of inertia and entropy. And inertia is the property of a mass that's resistant to change. So that's the feeling you feel when you go around a corner too fast and you want to, inertia wants you to push you through the door of your car. Entropy is the degree of disorder in a system, the chaos in a system. And these are important in thinking about strategy, because successful strategies often owe a great deal to the inertia and the entropy of their rivals. So a lot of businesses have a lot of momentum, especially this relates to the incumbent response. They have a lot of inertia, some businesses are going to be more agile than others in this time. And if your business is one that is agile, that can change, that can move, there's some advantage that can be grasped hold of. So understand, what is the inertia of your rivals or the other parties in the business? Again, this could be very, very powerful, because your business's survival may depend on partnering with another party where the inertia is going in the right direction. And so there's always the flip side of these two. An organization's greatest challenge may not be the external, but the internal. And so that inertia and entropy, remember the entropy is the level of disorder. Organizational renewal is absolutely critical and a priority. And during this time, and it's a good place to wind down and think about the dynamics. During this time, it's important to examine ourselves and ask ourselves the question, so what is routine in our businesses? So what have we always done that we need to change, especially given the crisis? So be aware of that in terms of how that can either inhibit or create opportunity for us to change things. What is the inertia of culture? So culture in our organizations, the elements of social behavior. So social behavior tends to settle. It becomes fairly strong, it resists change. We need to start thinking of what areas in the business we can simplify, we can refresh, we can reassemble, redesign to create or to unlock value in our businesses. And then thirdly, the inertia by proxy. So the way an organization chooses to respond not to change, or not to respond to change, as that would threaten its existing position. And so in the marketplaces we're involved in, there are those that are choosing not to do anything because their current position could be threatened. And each of these, what will remain, what will not? And those are questions we need to think about in our own businesses. What sources of inertia do you experience in your own businesses? What sources of inertia do you experience in the marketplace as well? And then lastly, entropy. Entropy is often a sign of weak management. It's the disorder, the chaos in a system. And this is an opportunity in the time we have to, in a sense, step out of our businesses, redesign, relook at the value opportunities, relook at the dynamics, relook at the leverage points in our business, and ask the question, well, where do we see entropy at work in our organization and in our industry? And how are we going to change? How are we going to readapt and refresh our own businesses and also respond to the businesses or the sector that we're involved in? And so I know there's been a lot of information and a lot of ideas and thoughts, but go back and relook at those and see what elements you can review in your own businesses, review in the sectors you're in. Obviously, we're looking for renewal as things change going forward. But I trust that you have some material to think about and to reimagine the way forward. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us online for this webinar. A survey will appear as I close it off. If there are any last questions, comments, thoughts, as you're thinking of that, we're also putting together some of the material, the concepts, the thoughts into a half-day online workshop called Navigating COVID-19. And especially now as things unfold, I think the important thing is to start looking ahead and really examine some of these as we go forward. And Mahesh, speed of response and flexibility is absolutely critical and crucial. And yet don't allow your need for speed to stop you creating a gap to think. Because I think that's what some of these challenges we have, is that we become into the reactive mode as opposed to creating the gap, think about things, and then move forward. And that's what this webinar has been aimed at doing, just providing some ideas and thoughts to provoke thinking and conversations for your team. I suggest maybe share this video with your team, this webinar with your team, and stop and pause it and say, well, what does our business look like in this time? And so if you want to get hold of us, you are welcome to do so. We are in the business of, we are in the business of helping businesses through this time. We really want to, explore ways that we can help. And so even going through this webinar has been very powerful for me to rethink our business and say, well, where are the areas where we can unlock difference, where we can unlock advantage? Where are the areas that we can unlock leverage in our businesses as well? Questions, Carl, what is the convergence point of the predictable bias and the systematic thinking? I think one of the concepts, and another thing to do as you think through these concepts, is to also see how they are interrelated. I think you mean systems thinking. So systems thinking helps identify what elements of the business are linked to other parts of the business. And so there's a predictable response that we can often follow through, especially where there's predictable bias in our own businesses. And so it's the knee-jerk reaction that sometimes happens as a result of us doing something. And sometimes that's good. We can harness that movement or that reaction. Sometimes it's not that good. And so thank you once again for taking the time. I trust it's been valuable. I know this one has been a little bit different in terms of, more about just getting a whole lot of information out there, but I encourage you to explore the strategies. And as we start to see through this blizzard, we start to navigate the way forward. Let us know how we can help. Thank you so much. Signing off.